Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Artemisia of Caria, a woman whose life defied every expectation of her time, a queen who commanded warships in the greatest naval battle of the ancient world, and a leader whose counsel was sought by the most powerful emperor the world had yet known. Her story takes us to the sun-drenched coasts of Asia Minor in the 5th century BC, to a world of Greek city-states and Persian empires, of marble temples and bronze-prowed warships, of honor and pragmatism, loyalty and survival. Settle in, perhaps with a warm drink, and let us journey together back 2,500 years to meet a remarkable woman who navigated the treacherous waters of ancient geopolitics with wisdom, courage, and an uncommon clarity of vision. The world she was born into. To understand Artemisia, we must first understand the world that shaped her. She was born sometime around 520 BC into the ruling family of Halicarnassus, a prosperous Greek city on the southwestern coast of what is now Turkey, in the region known as Caria. This was a world caught between civilizations, where Greek culture met Persian power, where the ancient traditions of the Carian people blended with Hellenic sophistication. Halicarnassus itself was a jewel of the ancient world. Built on a natural harbor with hills rising behind it, the city commanded magnificent views across the azure waters of the Ceramic Gulf. White buildings climbed the slopes, their walls gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. The harbor bustled with merchant vessels from across the known world, Egyptian grain ships, Phoenician traders, Greek triremes, and Persian royal messengers. The air would have been filled with a dozen languages, the scent of spices and salt water, the calls of merchants, and the rhythmic chanting of oarsmen. But Halicarnassus was more than just a trading port. It was a city of Greek heritage that had come under Persian dominion. When Cyrus the Great had conquered the kingdom of Lydia in the 540s BC, the Greek cities of Asia Minor, known collectively as Ionia, had fallen under Persian control. Unlike the independent city-states of mainland Greece, these Eastern Greeks lived as subjects of the Persian Empire, paying tribute to the great king and providing ships and soldiers when required. This was not necessarily a harsh arrangement. The Persians, for all their military might, were often pragmatic rulers. They allowed local customs to continue, permitted Greek culture to flourish, and generally ruled through local dynasties rather than imposing Persian governors. The price was loyalty, tribute, and military service when the empire called. For many of these cities, Persian rule brought stability, access to vast trade networks, and protection from rivals. Artemisia was born into the ruling family during this period of Persian dominion. Her father, Lygdamis, was the tyrant, the autocratic ruler of Halicarnassus. The term tyrant didn't carry the same negative connotations in ancient Greece that it does today. A tyrant was simply someone who had seized power outside the traditional aristocratic or democratic frameworks. Some tyrants were beloved benefactors who brought prosperity. Others were despised oppressors. Lygdamis appears to have been competent and shrewd, maintaining good relations with the Persian court while keeping his city prosperous. Her mother was Cretan, from the large island south of the Greek mainland. This mixed heritage, Carian and Greek on her father's side, Greek from another region on her mother's, gave Artemisia connections across the Hellenic world. She grew up bilingual, possibly multilingual, speaking Greek certainly, likely Carian, and perhaps some Persian as well. These languages would serve her well in the complicated diplomatic world she would navigate. The Caria of her youth was a land of contrasts. Ancient Carian traditions persisted alongside Greek culture. The Carians were renowned seafarers and warriors, known for their distinctive helmets and their service as mercenaries throughout the Mediterranean. They had their own gods, their own customs, their own fierce pride. Yet they had also absorbed much Greek culture over centuries of contact, adopting Greek architectural styles, attending Greek religious festivals, and participating in the broader Hellenic cultural world. Artemisia's childhood would have been unlike that of most Greek girls. As a member of a ruling family, she would have received an education far beyond what was typical for women of her era. She must have learned to read and write, studied poetry and history, learned the arts of diplomacy and administration. Most crucially, she would have been taught about power, how to acquire it, how to maintain it, how to exercise it wisely. She would have observed her father governing, sitting in on councils, learning the delicate balance of keeping the Persians satisfied while maintaining local autonomy. She would have learned about maritime trade, about the movement of goods and information across the sea lanes. She would have understood, from an early age, that survival in her world required intelligence, flexibility, and the willingness to make difficult choices. The sea was central to everything. Halicarnassus looked out across waters that connected worlds. To the west lay the Greek mainland and islands, free cities that owed no allegiance to Persia. To the east lay the vast Persian Empire, stretching from Asia Minor to India, from the Caucasus Mountains to Egypt. Artemisia grew up understanding that her city existed at this crucial crossroads, that its prosperity depended on navigating between these powers, that the sea was both highway and frontier. The path to power. The exact circumstances of how Artemisia came to rule Halicarnassus are somewhat unclear, lost in the mists of time. What we know comes primarily from Herodotus, the great Greek historian who wrote about the Persian Wars a few decades after the events he described. According to Herodotus, Artemisia ruled Halicarnassus, as well as the nearby islands of Kos, Nisyros, and Kalymnos, after the death of her husband. This tells us several important things. First, she initially came to power through marriage rather than direct inheritance from her father. She married a man who was either related to the ruling family or who had himself become tyrant of Halicarnassus. When he died, we don't know how or when, Artemisia assumed power, presumably as regent for her young son, whose name we unfortunately do not know. That she was able to assume this role speaks volumes about her character and capabilities. Ancient Greece was not a society that readily accepted female rule. Women were expected to manage households, not cities. They were to be modest, retiring, focused on domestic matters. Political and military affairs were the exclusive domain of men. Yet here was Artemisia, not only claiming power, but maintaining it. This was no figurehead position. She didn't simply hold a title while men made the real decisions. She actively governed, made policy decisions, commanded military forces, and engaged in diplomacy at the highest levels. For her to accomplish this, she must have been extraordinarily capable and forceful. Several factors likely contributed to her success. First, she had the legitimacy of family connection. She was descended from the ruling dynasty and was the widow of the previous ruler. Second, she appears to have had the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the Persian court. The great king's approval was essential for anyone ruling in territories under Persian control. Third, and perhaps most importantly, she must have quickly demonstrated her competence. In the brutal political world of the ancient Mediterranean, those who couldn't effectively rule didn't last long. As ruler of Halicarnassus and its dependencies, Artemisia faced complex challenges. She had to maintain order in her territories, ensure economic prosperity, collect taxes for the Persian treasury, provide ships and crews when required. and navigate the intricate web of relationships with other local rulers, Persian officials, and the distant court of the great king himself. She also had to be constantly aware of the larger forces at play in her world. During her rule, tensions between the Persian Empire and the free Greek states were rising. These tensions had a long history, rooted in the Ionian Revolt of 490 to 494 BC, when the Greek cities of Asia Minor had risen up against Persian rule. The Ionian Revolt was a pivotal event that would shape everything that followed. The catalyst was the tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, who convinced the Ionian cities to rebel against Persia. The revolt spread quickly along the coast, and the rebels even received support from Athens and Eretria, cities on the Greek mainland. In a bold stroke, the rebels marched inland and burned Sardis, the regional capital of the Persian Empire. But the revolt ultimately failed. The Persians, with their vast resources, gradually reasserted control. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Lade in 494 BC, where the Persian fleet defeated the combined Ionian navy. The subsequent Persian reconquest was brutal. Miletus was sacked, its men killed, its women and children enslaved. Other cities that had rebelled were dealt with harshly. Artemisia would have been in her 20s during these events. The lesson was clear. Rebellion against Persia led to destruction. Loyalty, or at least pragmatic submission, offered the possibility of survival and even prosperity. This lesson surely shaped her thinking in the years that followed. After crushing the Ionian revolt, the Persian king Darius III decided that the threat from mainland Greece needed to be addressed. Athens and Eretria had aided the rebels. They would be punished. Moreover, bringing the Greek mainland under Persian control would secure the western frontier of the empire and eliminate a source of instability. The first Persian expedition against mainland Greece came in 492 BC, but it met disaster when the Persian fleet was wrecked by a storm off Mount Athos. A second expedition in 490 BC succeeded in destroying Eretria, but was then defeated by the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon. This defeat was embarrassing but not catastrophic for Persia, a single setback on the remote western edge of their vast empire. But it couldn't stand. Darius began planning a much larger expedition, but he died in 486 BC before it could be launched. His son Xerxes inherited the throne and the plan for revenge. The Great Invasion. Xerxes, who became the great king of Persia in 486 BC, was determined to complete what his father had started, but his planned invasion of Greece would be no punitive raid like previous expeditions. This would be a massive military operation designed to conquer all of Greece and bring the fractious city-states under Persian control once and for all. The preparations took years. Xerxes assembled what may have been the largest military force the ancient world had yet seen. Herodotus, never one for understatement, claimed there were over 5 million people involved, including soldiers, support staff, and followers. Modern historians estimate the actual numbers were probably closer to 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers, plus naval crews and support personnel, still an enormous host by ancient standards. The army included contingents from across the vast Persian Empire. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Arabs, Ethiopians, and many others. It was a multicultural force speaking dozens of languages, wearing different armor and bearing different weapons, but all united under the command of the great king. The navy was equally impressive. According to Herodotus, there were 1,107 warships in the fleet, contributed by the maritime peoples of the empire. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, Cilicians, and the Greeks of Asia Minor, including Artemisia of Halicarnassus, It was customary for subject peoples under Persian rule to contribute military forces when the empire went to war. This was part of the arrangement, the price of Persian protection and the benefit of Persian trade networks. When Xerxes called for ships and sailors from the Greek cities of Asia Minor, Artemisia answered. Herodotus tells us that Artemisia personally commanded 5 ships. This might seem like a small contribution compared to the hundreds of vessels provided by others, but it was significant. 5 triremes represented a substantial investment and required several hundred trained oarsmen and sailors. Moreover, Artemisia didn't send these ships under another's command. She led them herself. This was extraordinary. Naval command was an exclusively male domain in the ancient world. War, especially naval warfare, required physical strength, courage, and command presence. The idea of a woman commanding warships would have seemed absurd to most Greeks and Persians alike. Yet there was Artemisia, not just sending her required contribution, but personally taking command. She boarded her flagship. We can imagine it decorated distinctively, so it would be recognizable in the chaos of battle, and joined the vast Persian fleet as it gathered for the invasion. Herodotus provides a remarkable detail about her participation. He notes that among all the commanders who advised Xerxes, her opinions were held in the highest regard by the king. This is extraordinary praise, suggesting that Artemisia wasn't just another naval commander, but a trusted counselor whose wisdom Xerxes particularly valued. The Persian invasion began in the spring of 480 BC. Xerxes' route was carefully planned. Rather than risk the sea crossing from Asia to Europe, he chose to march his vast army overland through Thrace and down into Greece. To facilitate this, Persian engineers had constructed a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. This was an engineering marvel of the ancient world. Hundreds of ships lashed together to form a floating bridge across a mile-wide strait. According to Herodotus, when the first bridge was destroyed by a storm, Xerxes ordered the Hellespont to be lashed with chains as punishment. A story that may be apocryphal but captures the great king's determination and the theatrical displays of power that characterized Persian kingship. The army crossed into Europe and began its march south. The fleet sailed along the coast, remaining in communication with the land forces and providing supplies. This coordination between army and navy was crucial to the Persian strategy. The fleet protected the army's flank and ensured a steady supply line, while the army's advance cleared coastal areas and secured harbors for the fleet. Artemisia and her 5 ships were part of this great naval expedition. As they sailed south along the coast of Thrace and then into Greek waters, she would have witnessed the might of the Persian Empire on full display. The sight must have been awe-inspiring. Hundreds of warships extending to the horizon, their bronze rams gleaming, their oars rising and falling in rhythm, their colorful sails filling with wind. The Greeks, meanwhile, were scrambling to organize a defense. The threat was obvious and existential. If Persia conquered Greece, the cherished freedom of the city-states would end. They would become subjects of the great king, paying tribute, providing soldiers, losing their autonomy. But uniting Greece was no simple matter. The Greek world consisted of hundreds of independent city-states, each fiercely protective of its sovereignty. They competed with each other constantly, economically, politically, militarily. Many had ancient rivalries and enmities. Getting them to cooperate against even the gravest external threat was a Herculean challenge. Nevertheless, some of the major city-states did form an alliance to resist Persia. Led by Sparta and Athens, this Hellenic League represented the first time in history that multiple Greek states had united for a common military purpose. But many other Greek cities chose neutrality or even sided with Persia, believing resistance was futile or seeing opportunities in Persian victory. The first major confrontation came at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass in central Greece. King Leonidas of Sparta led a small force of Greeks to hold this bottleneck against the vast Persian army. The battle became legendary. For 3 days, the Greeks held the pass, inflicting heavy casualties on the Persians. But ultimately, a Greek traitor showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. The Greek force was outflanked. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with several hundred Thespians and Thebans, fought to the death in a last stand that would echo through history. While this land battle raged, the Persian fleet was engaged with the Greek navy at nearby Artemisium. In 3 days of naval skirmishing and 1 major battle, neither side achieved decisive victory. The Persian fleet suffered significant losses in storms and in combat, but the Greek fleet was also badly damaged and had to withdraw when news came of the defeat at Thermopylae. With Thermopylae breached, central Greece lay open to the Persians. The Greek allies fell back. Athens was evacuated, its population fleeing to the nearby island of Salamis and the Peloponnese. The Persian army entered Attica, captured Athens, and burned the city's temples on the Acropolis in revenge for the burning of Sardis during the Ionian Revolt. The Greek situation looked desperate. The Persian army controlled central Greece. The Persian fleet had numerical superiority. Many Greek states had already submitted to Xerxes or were considering it. The alliance was on the verge of collapse. It was at this crucial moment that the stage was set for the battle that would make Artemisia famous. The Council before Salamis. As the Persian fleet anchored in the waters around Athens in September of 480 BC, Xerxes called a council of war to decide the next move. The Greek fleet had withdrawn to the narrow strait between Salamis and the mainland. Should the Persians attack them there, or pursue a different strategy? This council is described in detail by Herodotus, and while we should be cautious about accepting his account as literal truth, he was writing decades later and constructing dramatic narratives. The broad outlines are probably reliable. Xerxes had his throne set up and summoned the commanders of the various naval contingents. This was standard Persian practice. While the great king's word was absolute, Persian monarchs often consulted with advisors and military commanders. A wise king listened to counsel, even if he ultimately made his own decisions. One by one, the commanders spoke. The overwhelming majority urged Xerxes to attack the Greek fleet immediately. Their reasoning was straightforward. The Persians had numerical superiority. The Greeks were demoralized after recent defeats, and aggressive action would prevent the Greek alliance from recovering and reorganizing. But when Artemisia's turn came to speak, she offered a completely different perspective. According to Herodotus, Artemisia counseled against a naval battle. She argued that Xerxes should not risk his fleet in the narrow waters of Salamis. Instead, she advised patience. The Persian army controlled Athens and central Greece. Time was on Persia's side. If Xerxes simply maintained his position and advanced slowly into the Peloponnese by land, the Greek alliance would collapse on its own. Her reasoning was sophisticated. The Greeks, she argued, couldn't maintain their unity for long. They were natural rivals who had been forced into cooperation by crisis. Keep the pressure on them without risking everything in one battle, and they would turn on each other. Sparta would want to defend the Peloponnese. Athens and other states would resent Spartan priorities. Smaller cities would see opportunities in betraying the alliance. Moreover, she pointed out the tactical disadvantages of fighting in the confined waters of the Salamis Strait. The Persian advantage in numbers would be neutralized in such cramped quarters. The heavier, less maneuverable Persian ships might struggle against the more agile Greek triremes in close waters. Why risk the fleet when patient strategy could achieve the same result? Then Artemisia added something even more remarkable. If Xerxes insisted on a naval battle, she suggested he should not participate in it himself. The king should remain with the army. If the fleet won, excellent. The victory would be Xerxes. If the fleet lost, it wouldn't matter much as long as the army remained intact. The war would continue, and with the army commanding the land, Xerxes would still hold the advantage. This was extraordinarily bold advice. In essence, she was telling the great king that his navy might lose and that he should be prepared for that possibility. She was advocating for risk management over glory-seeking, for strategic patience over immediate gratification. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes' advisors were appalled by Artemisia's counsel. Some reportedly hoped she would be punished for such defeatism. How dare she suggest that the mighty Persian fleet might be defeated? How dare she counsel caution when victory seemed within grasp? But Xerxes, according to Herodotus, reacted very differently. He praised Artemisia's advice, saying she was the only one among his counselors who truly understood the situation. He admired her courage in speaking truthfully, rather than simply telling him what he wanted to hear. Nevertheless, Xerxes decided to reject her advice. The majority of his commanders favored attack, and the king chose to trust in Persian numerical superiority. The fleet would engage the Greeks at Salamis. This episode reveals much about both Artemisia and Xerxes. Artemisia demonstrated strategic acumen that surpassed that of her fellow commanders. She understood that warfare wasn't just about numbers and bravery, but about choosing the right time and place to fight. She recognized the dangers of the Salamis battlefield and the advantages of patience. She was willing to speak an unpopular truth to power. Xerxes, for his part, showed why he valued Artemisia's counsel. He didn't punish her for disagreeing with him or for suggesting his fleet might lose. Instead, he praised her wisdom even as he chose not to follow it. This suggests a degree of mutual respect between the queen of Halicarnassus and the king of kings. Some historians have wondered whether there was more to their relationship. Ancient sources don't suggest a romantic connection, but they do indicate genuine esteem. In a court where flattery was common and dissent dangerous, Artemisia apparently felt secure enough to speak her mind, and Xerxes valued her enough to welcome her honesty. The decision made, the Persian fleet prepared for battle. Artemisia and her ships took their assigned position in the Persian line. Whatever her private reservations, she would fight for the king she served. The Battle of Salamis. The Battle of Salamis, fought in late September 480 BC, would become one of the most consequential naval engagements in human history. The narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the mainland of Attica became the stage for a clash that would determine whether Persian or Greek civilization would dominate the Mediterranean world. The Greek fleet numbered perhaps 380 warships, primarily from Athens, but with significant contingents from other allied cities. The Persian fleet was much larger, perhaps 600 to 700 ships, after losses at Artemisium and in storms. But in the confined waters of the strait, numbers would matter less than maneuverability, tactics, and fighting spirit. The Greek commander, the Athenian Themistocles, had deliberately chosen this battlefield. He understood that in narrow waters, the Persian numerical advantage would be reduced. The Persians wouldn't be able to surround and overwhelm the Greek fleet. Instead, the battle would become a series of ship-to-ship encounters where Greek skill and heavier construction might prevail. Moreover, Themistocles had sent a false message to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greeks were planning to flee, and that if the Persians attacked immediately, they could catch the Greek fleet divided and demoralized. This stratagem, if Herodotus is to be believed, helped convince Xerxes to commit to battle despite Artemisia's contrary advice. The battle began at dawn. Xerxes had his throne set up on a hillside overlooking the strait, so he could watch the engagement and see which of his commanders performed valiantly. Scribes stood ready to record the deeds of those who distinguished themselves. The Persian fleet moved into the strait in formation, but almost immediately things began to go wrong. The narrow waters made it difficult to maintain formation. Ships began bunching up, colliding with each other, interfering with each other's oar strokes. The Phoenician squadrons on one wing found themselves pressed against the shore. The careful Persian battle plan dissolved into chaos. The Greeks, by contrast, held back initially, maintaining formation and discipline. Then, at the right moment, they attacked. The Greek triremes were built differently from many of the Persian ships, heavier and more solidly constructed, designed to ram and board rather than just maneuver. In the close quarters of the strait, these differences mattered enormously. The battle became a swirling melee of hundreds of warships. Bronze rams tore through hulls. Ships rammed each other at full speed, the impact throwing oarsmen from their benches. When ships locked together, Marines clambered aboard enemy vessels, fighting hand-to-hand on slippery decks. Men fell into the water and drowned, weighed down by armor. Oars were shattered. Ships were holed and sank. Crews abandoned sinking vessels and tried to swim to safety. The noise must have been overwhelming. The crash of colliding ships, the splintering of wood, the shouts of officers, the screams of wounded men, the splash of bodies and debris hitting the water. It was in this chaos that Artemisia found herself in a desperate situation. Herodotus provides a detailed account of her actions during the battle, and while the specifics have been debated by historians, the story remains one of the most famous incidents of the engagement. According to Herodotus, Artemisia's ship was being pursued by an Athenian trireme commanded by Aminias of Pallene. Whether Aminias recognized her ship specifically or simply saw a target of opportunity isn't clear, but he was pressing the pursuit aggressively. Artemisia couldn't outrun her pursuer, and fighting was unlikely to succeed. She needed another option. Ahead of her was a Persian or allied ship. Sources identify it variously as either Persian or from Kalymnos, one of Artemisia's own subject territories. In a split-second decision, Artemisia ordered her helmsman to ram this friendly vessel. The Kalyndian or Persian ship sank quickly, apparently with all hands. The Athenian commander, seeing this, assumed that Artemisia's ship must be either Greek or a deserter from the Persian side, helping the Greek cause. He broke off his pursuit to engage other targets. From his position on the hillside, Xerxes observed this incident. When he asked his courtiers whose ship it was, they identified it as Artemisia's. They could recognize her ship's distinctive markings even from a distance. When asked what ship she had sunk, they told him it was an enemy vessel. Xerxes famously responded, "My men have become women, and my women men." This anecdote, whether entirely accurate or not, has echoed through history. It captures several truths: Artemisia's reputation for effectiveness, Xerxes' continuing regard for her, and the irony of a female commander being among the most capable in the Persian fleet. But we should also consider what this story reveals about Artemisia's character and decision-making. She had to make an instantaneous choice in the heat of battle, face probable defeat and possible death, or sacrifice an allied ship to save her own. She chose survival, decisively and without apparent hesitation. This was the same pragmatic calculation that had characterized her entire career. She was a survivor in a dangerous world, willing to do what was necessary to preserve herself and her power. The crew of that Calindian or Persian ship paid the price for her survival, but from Artemisia's perspective, this was preferable to having both ships lost. Some have seen this as evidence of ruthless amorality. Others view it as rational decision-making in an impossible situation. Perhaps both perspectives have merit. Artemisia was neither a saint nor a villain. She was a person navigating the brutal realities of ancient warfare and politics with whatever tools and tactics were available. As the battle continued, the Persian position deteriorated. The Greeks were winning throughout the strait. Persian ships were being sunk or captured. Others, trying to escape, ran aground or collided with each other. The Persian commanders, despite their numbers, could not coordinate effectively in the confined space. The battle became a disaster. By the end of the day, perhaps 200 Persian ships had been destroyed or captured, while Greek losses were minimal, around 40 ships. It was a decisive and devastating defeat. The mighty Persian fleet, which had seemed invincible just days before, had been shattered by a smaller Greek force fighting on their home waters with better tactics. Xerxes watched it all from his throne on the hillside. The king, who had believed his forces were invincible, had just witnessed them beaten badly. His admirals and commanders had failed him. His strategy, urged by the majority, contradicting Artemisia's advice, had led to catastrophe. That evening, as the surviving Persian ships limped back to their anchorages and commanders assembled to report to the king, one can imagine Xerxes remembering Artemisia's counsel. She had warned him against exactly this. She had understood what others had not, that numbers alone weren't enough, that the battlefield itself mattered, that patience might be wiser than aggression. And she had survived the battle, even thrived in a sense, earning the king's praise for her actions. Whatever moral complications attended her ramming of a friendly vessel, from a Persian perspective she had demonstrated resourcefulness, combat effectiveness, and the ability to think quickly under pressure. After the battle, the defeat at Salamis transformed the strategic situation. The Persian fleet was badly weakened. More importantly, Persian confidence was shaken. The aura of inevitability that had surrounded Xerxes' invasion was broken. The Greeks had proven they could win. In the aftermath, Xerxes faced a critical decision: what to do next. He called another council of war, and again Artemisia's voice carried weight. According to Herodotus, Xerxes sent a messenger specifically to Artemisia to ask her advice. This private consultation, separate from the general council, indicates the special trust Xerxes placed in her judgment. He wanted her unvarnished opinion, not advice shaped by what others might think. Artemisia's counsel was clear. Xerxes himself should return to Persia. The naval defeat had made his position in Greece precarious. If the Greek fleet could now threaten his line of retreat by attacking the bridges over the Hellespont, the king might be trapped in Europe. That risk was unacceptable. However, she didn't advocate for complete withdrawal. The army remained intact and formidable. Xerxes should leave a large force under his cousin Mardonius to continue the campaign. With the army's overwhelming numerical superiority on land, Persia could still potentially conquer Greece. but the king himself should ensure his safety by returning home. This advice was, again, remarkably astute. It acknowledged the defeat honestly, without overstating its consequences. It prioritized the king's safety, which was paramount for the empire's stability, while keeping Persian options open. It was the advice of someone who understood both the military realities and the political implications of the situation. Xerxes followed this advice. He left Mardonius with a substantial army, perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 men, and began his return to Persia. The fleet, including Artemisia's ships, escorted him part of the way. Herodotus tells one more story about Artemisia during this period. He says that Xerxes entrusted her with escorting some of his illegitimate sons back to Ephesus. This mission, if true, demonstrates the extraordinary trust Xerxes had in her. Royal sons were valuable assets, potential heirs, dynastic marriages, political pawns. Entrusting them to Artemisia's protection was a signal honor. With this mission completed, Artemisia disappears from our historical sources. We don't know the exact date or circumstances of her return to Halicarnassus, or what happened to her afterward. She successfully returned to her city, presumably resumed her rule, and lived out her remaining years in relative obscurity as far as the historical record is concerned. The war, meanwhile, continued. In 479 BC, the remaining Persian forces were defeated at the Battle of Plataea on land and the Battle of Mycale at sea. The Persian invasion had failed. Greece would remain free, and the Persian Empire would never again attempt to conquer the Greek mainland. The historical Artemisia. So who was the real Artemisia, and how should we understand her life and choices? Our primary source for her story is Herodotus, writing a generation after the events he described. Herodotus was from Halicarnassus himself, the city Artemisia had ruled, so he may have had access to local memories and traditions about her. But he was also a storyteller, constructing narratives with dramatic flair, and we should be cautious about accepting every detail as literal fact. Nevertheless, the broad outlines seem reliable. Artemisia was a real historical figure who ruled Halicarnassus and nearby territories in the early 5th century BC. She personally commanded her city's naval contingent in Xerxes' invasion of Greece. She participated in the Battle of Salamis. She was held in high regard by Xerxes, who valued her counsel. These basic facts seem well established. What we make of these facts is another matter. For much of history, Artemisia has been viewed through the lens of gender. She was, after all, a woman exercising power in an overwhelmingly male domain. This made her either fascinating or scandalous, depending on one's perspective. Ancient Greek writers after Herodotus generally portrayed her negatively, as might be expected. She had fought against Greece on the Persian side. She represented barbarian autocracy rather than Greek freedom. And perhaps most troublingly for Greek sensibilities, she demonstrated that a woman could be as effective a commander as men. This challenged fundamental Greek assumptions about gender and society. Later writers, particularly in the Renaissance and afterward, often romanticized Artemisia. She became a symbol of female capability, proof that women could excel in traditionally male roles if given the opportunity. Some stories, not found in ancient sources, even developed suggesting a romantic relationship between her and Xerxes. Modern historians have tried to understand Artemisia in the context of her own time and place. She was a product of a specific political and cultural environment, the Greek cities of Asia, Minor under Persian rule, where survival required navigating between different powers and traditions. Her choice to support Persia wasn't about ideology or values in the way we might think of such choices today. She didn't fight for Persia because she believed in Persian civilization or opposed Greek freedom. She fought for Persia because that was where her interests lay. Halicarnassus was part of the Persian Empire. Her power derived from Persian acceptance of her rule. When the great king called for ships and commanders, she answered that call because the alternative, rebellion, would likely have meant the destruction of her city and her own death. This was the same calculation made by all the other tyrants and leaders of the Greek cities in Asia Minor. They provided ships and men to Xerxes because they were his subjects and because open defiance of the world's greatest empire seemed suicidal. We remember Artemisia particularly because she was unusual in her gender and apparently exceptional in her ability. But her fundamental situation was shared by many others. Her counsel to Xerxes before Salamis reveals sophisticated strategic thinking. She understood that warfare involved more than just courage and numbers. Terrain, timing, political factors, risk management, all these mattered. Her advice was fundamentally about preserving power and minimizing risk, which was exactly how most successful leaders thought in her era. The incident during the battle, the ramming of a friendly ship, remains controversial. Some see it as an unforgivable act, sacrificing innocent lives to save her own. Others argue it was a split-second decision in combat, made under extreme pressure with no good options. Perhaps both perspectives have merit. What's clear is that Artemisia was a survivor and a realist. She made the choices necessary to preserve her own life and power. She was neither sentimental nor apologetic about this. In the brutal world of ancient Mediterranean politics, such traits were often necessary for survival. Legacy and memory. After the Persian Wars, Artemisia apparently returned to Halicarnassus and continued to rule. How long she lived and how she died, we simply don't know. She vanishes from the historical record after 480 BC, and we can only speculate about her final years. The city she ruled would continue to be important. Halicarnassus later became the capital of the Carian satrapy under Persian rule. In the 4th century BC, it became even more famous as the site of the Mausoleum, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, built as a tomb for Mausolus, the Persian satrap of Caria. By an interesting coincidence, Mausolus's widow, Artemisia II, ruled Caria after his death and completed the Mausoleum, another ruling woman of Halicarnassus, named after our Artemisia. The original Artemisia's legacy has been complex. For ancient Greeks, she was generally viewed negatively, a barbarian, an enemy, and troublingly for their cultural assumptions, a woman who excelled at war. Some Greek writers acknowledged her abilities while condemning her choices. Later ages often viewed her more favorably. During periods when female monarchy and rule were more accepted, Artemisia could be held up as an example of effective female leadership. Writers and artists found her story compelling material. The warrior queen, the wise counselor, the survivor of great battles. In modern times, she has sometimes been claimed as an early feminist icon, proof that women have always been capable of leadership and military command if given the opportunity. This perspective has merit, but can sometimes project modern concerns onto an ancient figure who probably wouldn't have thought in such terms. Perhaps it's most useful to see Artemisia simply as a capable person who happened to be a woman, living in a time and place that didn't usually allow women to exercise the kind of power she wielded. She took advantage of the opportunities available to her, the accident of royal birth, the consequences of her husband's death, her own demonstrated abilities, and the relative flexibility of Persian imperial rule compared to Greek democratic or aristocratic norms. She was neither a hero nor a villain in any simple sense. She was a pragmatic ruler doing what she thought necessary to survive and maintain her power. She served an empire that was foreign to many Greeks, but was also her own legitimate government. She made decisions in battle that saved her own life at the cost of others. She gave advice that proved correct, but went unheeded. She navigated a complex political world with apparent skill. The world she left behind. The defeat of the Persian invasion had enormous consequences for Western history. Had Persia succeeded in conquering Greece, the development of Western civilization would have been fundamentally different. Greek philosophy, drama, art, and political thought flourished in the decades after the Persian Wars, partly because Greece remained free to pursue its own path. The democratic experiment in Athens, the philosophical schools that produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the great playwrights and historians, all of this emerged in a Greece that had successfully resisted Persian domination. Artemisia played a small but real role in these events. She commanded ships at Salamis, though on the losing side. She advised Xerxes both before and after the battle. Her counsel, had it been followed, might have led to different outcomes, though exactly what those would have been, we can never know. The broader question of the Persian Wars raises interesting moral complexities. From a Greek perspective, this was clearly a defensive war against foreign invasion. The Greeks were fighting for their freedom, their cities, their way of life. This is how the story has usually been told in Western historical tradition, with the Greeks as heroes and the Persians as would-be oppressors. But, from a Persian perspective, things looked different. The Greek cities of Asia Minor had rebelled against legitimate Persian rule and had received support from Athens and other mainland cities. The Persian invasions were partly punitive expeditions against those who had aided rebellion and partly security operations to neutralize threats on the empire's western frontier. Moreover, Persian rule wasn't necessarily harsher than Greek rule. Many cities under Persian control prospered. The Persians were often tolerant of local customs and religions. The autocratic Persian system wasn't obviously worse than Greek systems that excluded most people from political participation and relied heavily on slavery. Artemisia, ruling in a Greek city under Persian sovereignty, embodied these complexities. She wasn't Greek fighting against Greece or Persian fighting for Persia. She was both and neither, a Carian-Greek ruler serving the Persian Empire, to which her city belonged, making pragmatic choices about power and survival. Reflections on power. Artemisia's story raises enduring questions about power, gender, loyalty, and leadership that remain relevant across millennia. Consider the question of gender. Artemisia wielded power in a world that normally reserved such power exclusively for men. She commanded warships, advised emperors, made strategic decisions that affected thousands of lives. She did all this not by pretending to be a man or by apologizing for being a woman, but simply by being effective. The ancient sources reflect discomfort with this. Herodotus presents her as exceptional, almost a curiosity, a woman who could think and act like a man. Xerxes' comment that his men had become women while his woman had become a man captures this ancient perspective. Gender roles were seen as natural categories, and Artemisia's transgression of them was remarkable. Yet she succeeded. The practical demands of ruling and commanding overcame, at least in her case, the ideological resistance to female authority. This suggests that many gender restrictions have been based more on custom and assumption than on actual inability. Artemisia wasn't superhuman. She was simply capable and was in a position where she could exercise that capability. At the same time, we shouldn't romanticize her situation. She was one exceptional individual who managed to acquire and maintain power in unusual circumstances. She didn't fundamentally change the societies she lived in or open doors for other women. After her, the Greek and Persian worlds remained overwhelmingly male-dominated in terms of political and military power. She was an exception that proved the rule, not the beginning of systematic change. The question of loyalty is also complex. Artemisia was loyal to Persia, the power that allowed her to rule Halicarnassus. But was this genuine loyalty or pragmatic submission? Did she believe in the Persian cause? Or was she simply doing what was necessary for survival? We can't answer this with certainty, but the evidence suggests pragmatism rather than ideology. Her advice to Xerxes was consistently cautious and risk-averse. She wasn't advocating for glorious conquest. She was counseling careful management of resources and strategic patience. This sounds like someone focused on practical outcomes rather than on serving some larger cause. This pragmatism was characteristic of many leaders in her position. The tyrants of the Greek cities in Asia Minor served Persia because the alternative was destruction. They weren't necessarily true believers in Persian supremacy. They were survivors making the best of their situation. Her leadership style, as revealed in the few examples we have, combined boldness with caution. She was willing to take decisive action, ramming a friendly ship to escape pursuit, but also advocated for strategic patience over risky aggression. This combination of tactical boldness and strategic caution is often found in successful leaders. Her relationship with Xerxes is also instructive. She was able to speak truth to power, to give advice that contradicted the king's inclinations and other advisors' counsel. Yet she did so in a way that maintained the king's respect. This is a delicate balance, being honest while not being insubordinate, being frank while being diplomatic. That Xerxes valued her counsel so highly speaks well of both of them. Artemisia had earned his trust through demonstrated competence. Xerxes, despite being an absolute monarch, was secure enough to listen to dissenting views and wise enough to recognize genuine expertise when he encountered it. The fog of history. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge. We know far less about Artemisia than we might wish. Almost everything we know comes from one source, Herodotus, writing a generation after the events. While Herodotus is generally considered reliable in broad outline, he was also constructing dramatic narratives and may have simplified, embellished, or misunderstood some details. We don't know the exact dates of Artemisia's birth or death. We don't know the name of her husband or son. We don't know most of the details of how she governed Halicarnassus. We don't have her own words. No speeches, no letters, no documents written by or for her have survived. What we have are glimpses, a few incidents, some reported statements, the outline of her participation in a great historical event. From these fragments, we try to reconstruct a life and a character. The process inevitably involves speculation, imagination, and the projection of our own interests and assumptions onto the incomplete evidence. Different eras have imagined Artemisia differently. For ancient Greeks, she was often an example of Persian barbarity and the dangers of female power. For medieval and Renaissance writers, she could be a romantic figure or a cautionary tale. For modern historians, she's a case study in female agency in the ancient world, in the complexities of the Persian wars, in the nature of power and leadership. Each interpretation reveals as much about the interpreters as about Artemisia herself. We see in her what we're looking for, what our own time and values lead us to emphasize. This isn't necessarily wrong. History is always a dialogue between past and present. but we should be aware of it. The real Artemisia, the lived experience of the woman who ruled Halicarnassus and fought at Salamis, is ultimately unknowable. We have facts, fragments, stories, and from these we construct narratives that make sense to us. But the inner life, her thoughts, her feelings, her private moments, her relationships beyond the political and military, all of this is lost to time. Perhaps that's as it should be. History gives us outlines and actions, causes and consequences. The full depth of individual human experience, even of famous historical figures, remains their own, private across the centuries. The meaning of Salamis. The Battle of Salamis, where Artemisia played her most famous role, has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. For the ancient Greeks, it was one of the defining moments of their civilization. The day when free Greeks defeated Persian tyranny, when courage and skill overcame mere numbers, when the West successfully defended itself against the East. This interpretation became foundational to Western identity. The idea that Europe was inherently different from and opposed to Asia, that freedom was a Western value threatened by Eastern despotism, that small free nations could triumph over vast empires. All of these ideas trace back partly to the Persian Wars, and particularly to Salamis. But this is only one way to understand the battle. From a Persian perspective, Salamis was a setback in a frontier campaign, significant but not catastrophic. The Persian Empire continued to exist and prosper for another 150 years. It remained the dominant power in the Near East. The failure to conquer Greece didn't fundamentally threaten Persian power or prosperity. From the perspective of the Greek cities in Asia Minor, Artemisia's world, Salamis was a distant battle between two powers, both of which claimed authority over them. These cities had to live with the consequences, regardless of who won. Persian defeat meant they would continue under Persian rule, which most had accepted as normal. Persian victory would have brought the mainland Greeks into the same situation. Either way, their own position wouldn't have changed dramatically. This perspective, of people caught between greater powers, trying to survive and maintain some autonomy while acknowledging the limits of their freedom, is perhaps the most relevant to most of human history. Most people most of the time haven't been free citizens of powerful states, but subjects of larger powers, trying to make the best of circumstances they didn't create and couldn't fully control. Artemisia embodied this perspective. She wasn't fighting for ideology or values in the abstract. She was managing the practical realities of power. When Persia called, she answered, because that's what survival required. When battle came, she fought as effectively as possible. When the battle was lost, she helped manage the consequences. This wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was human, understandable, and in its way, admirable. A woman in a man's world. We keep returning to the question of gender because it's central to Artemisia's historical significance. She matters partly because she was effective, but also because she was effective while being female in societies that strongly resisted female authority. It's worth considering what this means and doesn't mean. Artemisia's success doesn't prove that ancient societies had gender equality. They clearly didn't. Women in the Greek and Persian worlds had limited rights and opportunities. They were generally excluded from political power, military command, and many other public roles. But Artemisia's example does show that these restrictions were cultural rather than natural. She could command ships, devise strategy, and counsel emperors because these abilities aren't actually gender-specific. The barriers were social, not biological. Her case also reveals that these barriers, while powerful, weren't absolute. In unusual circumstances, royal birth, death of her husband, her own demonstrated competence, the relative flexibility of Persian rule, a capable woman could acquire and exercise power. The system resisted this, but it was possible. This suggests that throughout history, there have probably been many capable women who, in different circumstances, could have been leaders, commanders, and counselors, and innovators. Most never had the opportunity. A few, like Artemisia, found or created opportunities and made the most of them. The fact that we still find Artemisia remarkable after 2,500 years says something both about her exceptionalism and about the enduring nature of gender restrictions. If female military and political leaders had been common in the ancient world, she wouldn't stand out. That she does stand out highlights both the barriers she faced and the rarity of women in such positions. At the same time, focusing too much on gender can risk treating Artemisia as just a curiosity, the woman commander, rather than as a historical actor in her own right. She made decisions that affected major events. Her counsel, had it been followed, might have changed history. She survived and even profited from one of antiquity's greatest battles. These things matter regardless of her gender. Perhaps the most useful perspective is to see her gender as contextually important. It shaped her path to power and made her situation unusual, but not as defining her significance. She matters because of what she did and how she did it, not just because she did it while being female. The long view. From the perspective of 2,500 years later, what can we learn from Artemisia's story? First, perhaps, that history is more complex than simple narratives of heroes and villains. Artemisia was neither. She was a person navigating difficult circumstances with the resources available to her. She made pragmatic choices that prioritized survival and power preservation. These choices had consequences for others. The crew of that ship she rammed, the Greek cities she helped the Persians threaten, the historical trajectory that was influenced, however slightly, by her actions. Second, that gender restrictions have been powerful throughout history, but not absolute. Capable women have always existed. What has varied is the extent to which societies allowed them to exercise their capabilities. Artemisia found a way to do so in a context that generally forbade it. Her example reminds us that natural gender roles are often less natural than cultural. Third, that loyalty and identity are complicated in situations of imperial rule and divided allegiances. Artemisia was Greek by culture, Carian by heritage, and Persian by political allegiance. Which of these identities was real? Perhaps all of them, or perhaps none. Perhaps she was simply Artemisia of Halicarnassus, defining herself by her actions and choices rather than by any single inherited identity. Fourth, that good counsel isn't always followed. Artemisia understood the strategic situation before Salamis better than most of Xerxes' advisors. Her advice was sound. It was ignored. This pattern, wise counsel rejected in favor of aggressive action that leads to disaster, has repeated throughout history. Having the right answer isn't enough. It must also be accepted and implemented. Fifth, that survival often requires difficult moral choices. Ramming that friendly ship saved Artemisia's life and ship at the cost of another crew's lives. Was this justified? There's no easy answer. It was expedient, rational in narrow terms, and morally troubling. Many of history's difficult moments involve exactly such choices. The silence of the sources. One of the frustrating aspects of studying ancient history is how much is lost. For every person or event we know about, thousands are forgotten. Even for known figures like Artemisia, huge gaps exist in our knowledge. We don't know what Artemisia thought about the choices she made. Did she regret fighting against her fellow Greeks? Did she feel guilt about the ship she destroyed? Did she take pride in her accomplishments, or see them merely as necessary acts of survival? Did she feel constrained by her gender, or see it as irrelevant to her role? Did she love Xerxes, respect him, fear him, or simply view him as the political reality she had to manage? We don't know her inner life because our sources don't tell us. Herodotus gives us actions and some reported speech, but not thoughts or feelings. This is normal for ancient history. We usually have public actions without private motivations. This silence of the sources is particularly acute for women in ancient history. Even the relatively abundant information we have about Artemisia is exceptional. Most women, even elite women, appear in our sources only in passing, if at all. Their stories, their thoughts, their experiences are almost entirely lost. This means that reconstruction of ancient women's lives always involves significant speculation. We work from fragmentary evidence, extrapolating from what we know about their societies, trying to imagine what their experiences might have been like. This process is necessary but uncertain. For Artemisia, we're fortunate to have at least the outline of her public career. But the person behind that career, her personality, her relationships, her private thoughts, remains largely mysterious. We can imagine, but we cannot know. Her city after her. Halicarnassus, the city Artemisia ruled, continued to be significant long after her time. It remained under Persian control for another 150 years, until Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s BC. During Alexander's siege of Halicarnassus in 334 BC, the city put up fierce resistance. This suggests that the martial traditions Artemisia exemplified continued. The city was eventually captured and damaged, but was later rebuilt. In the 4th century BC, as mentioned earlier, Halicarnassus became the capital of Caria under Mausolus, a semi-independent satrap who ruled under nominal Persian authority. The mausoleum he built there, completed after his death by his widow Artemisia II, became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a massive tomb that demonstrated the wealth and ambition of the Carian dynasty. The choice to name this later ruler Artemisia was probably not coincidental. The first Artemisia had been Halicarnassus's most famous ruler. Taking her name connected the later Artemisia to this tradition of female rule in the city. Halicarnassus continued to be important in the Hellenistic period and later under Roman rule. It was the birthplace of Herodotus, the historian who preserved Artemisia's story. In the Middle Ages, it became known as Bodrum and remained a significant port. Today, modern Bodrum is a popular resort town in Turkey, and the remains of the mausoleum, one of the few ancient wonders of which substantial remains survive, can still be visited. The city's evolution from Greek city-state to Persian, subject to Hellenistic capital, to Roman town, to medieval fortress, to modern resort spans thousands of years. Throughout these changes, the memory of Artemisia has persisted, a reminder of a time when a woman from this city commanded ships in one of history's decisive battles. Conclusion: a life across time. As we reach the end of our time together tonight, we're left with an incomplete but fascinating portrait. Artemisia of Halicarnassus lived in a pivotal moment of history. She was born into privilege, but also into precarious circumstances, ruling a Greek city under Persian authority in an era of rising tensions between 2 civilizations. She seized and held power in a world that didn't expect women to do so. She commanded warships in battle. She counseled emperors. She survived defeat and apparently lived to return home and continue ruling. She made hard choices and lived with their consequences. We don't know how long she lived after the Battle of Salamis. We don't know if she died in peace or turmoil, satisfied with her life or full of regrets. We don't know if her son succeeded her or what became of her family line. The historical record goes silent, leaving her fate to imagination. But her story, preserved by Herodotus and elaborated by later writers, has endured. Across 2,500 years, she remains vivid, not because we know everything about her, but because the pieces we do know are so striking. A woman commanding warships, a counselor speaking truth to the great king, a survivor making split-second decisions in battle, a ruler navigating between powers and civilizations. She stands for many things: female capability in restrictive circumstances, the complexity of the Persian wars beyond simple stories of Greek freedom versus Persian tyranny, the moral ambiguity of power and survival, the pragmatic calculations that leaders must make. Different readers will emphasize different aspects of her story based on their own interests and values. Perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest. She existed. She was real. A woman ruled and commanded and advised and survived in the ancient world, not because the world readily accepted female authority, but because circumstances allowed, and she was capable enough to seize the opportunity. Her existence proves that possibilities have always been wider than restrictions suggested, that human capability transcends gender, that history is full of exceptions and complexities. On quiet evenings, in the Turkish resort town of Bodrum that was once Halicarnassus, tourists walk along the harbor where Artemisia's ships once anchored. They visit the castle and the ruins, maybe the museum with its fragments of the ancient mausoleum. Few probably think about the queen who ruled here 2,500 years ago, who commanded 5 ships at Salamis, who advised the King of Kings. But she was there. She lived and ruled and fought and survived. Her voice echoed in the councils of Xerxes. Her ships sailed with the Persian fleet. Her decisions rippled through history in ways large and small. She was, in the end, a person, flawed, capable, pragmatic, remarkable, trying to navigate a complicated world with wisdom and courage. And that, more than anything, makes her story worth remembering. Thank you for joining me tonight in exploring the life of Artemisia of Caria. I hope her story has given you something to think about, some perspective on how women have exercised power throughout history, some insight into the complexities of the ancient world. May you rest well, with thoughts of ancient seas and marble cities, of bronze-prowed ships and difficult choices, of a woman who commanded in battle and counseled emperors, who survived and thrived in a world that said she shouldn't exist. Until next time, good night.